Namaste and welcome back to our continuing series Evenings with Sraddhalu. After a little break, we restart our evenings, and today we will continue part 7 on the current affairs. And we will be exploring in this part who are the disrupting globalist agenda personalities, and Sraddhalu will give us his speech. Namaste.
Namaste. Happy to be with all of you. Over the last few sessions, we have been building up a certain background, which I consider to be extremely important. So, for those of you who might be joining in now, do please watch all those before you come to this session, because a background has been built up where we looked at how, over the centuries, there has been an agenda, obviously rooted in forces which are not material, which want to prevent human evolution, delay it, divert it, or even subvert it entirely. At the same time, there is the push of the evolutionary force, which is a spiritual power, and inevitably in the long run, the spiritual power has to win. There is no question of a doubt there. The question is more of what happens in between and the struggles between these two forces. And there are forces which are organized across centuries to try to create a blockage. And it's human built because it's working through human instruments to try to subvert at each step any possibility of a forward movement and generally organize itself to block evolution on a global level, even as from the spiritual evolutionary force, the world is being unified more and more. Global unity is emerging planet-wide and in consciousness and a spiritual awakening. And what happens is the opposing forces use every step forward and the principle and the truth of it, catch it, subvert it, twist it and take it off track, or try at least. But one of the things which has happened with the increase of technological capabilities in the last 100 years in particular is that the ability to impact the masses by forces which are contrary to evolution is also greatly amplified. Now this is true of all, it's even greatly amplified for the light and forces of light. But the difference is the forces of light have not been organizing themselves. I would rather say human representatives of the forces of light have not been organizing themselves as efficiently, as completely as the forces which oppose evolution, because they have an advantage. The forces which oppose evolution have the advantage that their relationship with human beings is one of a grip of control. Those who choose to submit to their influence come under their grip and are easily then played like toys and then discarded. But the people may gain small term benefits, but in the long run they may lose and they don't care. That's the choice they have made. On the other side, for the forces of light, it has to be a choice, because the principle of spiritual evolution is a growth in freedom as a focal point for a center of freedom. So necessarily the spiritual consciousness cannot put you in its grip and compel you as the other side would. So in the beginning, always the opposing forces seem to have an advantage, and even in their organization, their coordination across unorganized centers across the world, who may not be externally overtly coordinated, but by the powers that control them like puppets, there is a coordination. And so we've given a background of how this works, how it has worked through these, what I have referred to as the cabal, and the framework that it has organized, trying to seize upon young people while they're young. For those who are more influential, who can be good instruments, effective instruments, catch them young, warp them, twist them, or at the very least, put them under a framework of blackmail. And so the result has been quite stifling for human evolution. On the other side is this forces of light, which necessarily have this initial disadvantage. But what we have seen over time is that while there is this global attempt for what I call a cabal-directed revolution, or rather a devolution to reverse evolution, There have been disruptors. We named two of them last time, and particularly Elon Musk, that I described how he built an infrastructure which can make possible human freedom, at least in principle. Whether we awaken as a collective sufficiently to take advantage of those facilities of an infrastructure is to be seen. Whether he is conscious of it or not is irrelevant. It's like the internet. The internet is an extraordinary organ created by spiritual consciousness for a worldwide dissemination, even a preparation for a wide awakening. I would even go so far as to say it is one of the organs organized by the supramental consciousness for preparing humanity. But as an organ, as a tool, it can be used for both. And the question is, are we going to use it for the betterment, or will the other side use it for the stifling and suffocation? So in the same sense, I mentioned last time how Elon Musk has built so many things, but there are many more things waiting. But key I spoke of was the Starlink alternate internet, which is not cabal controlled, and the electric cars, which can become a basis for a rapid change, and other tools which also he is putting together now through Twitter, where a platform where a free speech can be had, which had been completely blocked in the last 5 years. All over, across all the global media companies, free speech had been stifled entirely. And suddenly Twitter has made that change. And now this platform could also become a basis for a financial base of interchange, transfer of money, etc. Many more things which will follow. So this shows you a few points of potential escape through what would have been otherwise a very dark wall that blocks forward progress. I also spoke of Narendra Modi as Prime Minister of India as one of those who is a disruptor. Whether he's conscious of it or not, I will speak about a little bit today, elaborating on both of these a little bit and mention other disruptors. But I want to again warn you, which I mentioned last time, be very careful. Some of these names have been so linked with suggestions by the media using a technology which is a very refined technology of hypnosis, neuro-linguistic programming, mind control, whatever term one uses, or advertising technology, they're all the same really, to associate a name with a negative response. That sometimes the names will create a visceral reaction, provoke strong emotions in you, and if that happens, I will only request you just hold back, detach from those emotions, and wait, allow for information, data to come forward and review on the basis of objective data rather than a sentimental reaction. But just because a visceral reaction comes, don't identify with it. It's not yours. Recognize it as a programming because it has no basis. So these are two names I have taken so far, and I will mention some of the other names now because I find instead of doing them separately, it will be more useful to see parallels among them. So I'm going to mention a few more names and some I will keep for a later part of the discussion. We spoke of Elon Musk, we spoke of Modi, and there was one question which came, and I would like to answer that before we move on with Modi. It was a question from Animesh. Alina, are you online? So there was a question from Animesh where he asked last time in the chat box, isn't this oversimplification for making your point? Talking about facts, what could have been the reasons for changing Rafale deal, throwing Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, India's interest, to benefit a particular businessman? Alina is back. Can you take the question? Animesh's question? You don't have audio. Okay. So the question was, Modi made a decision with a deal for fighter planes from France, which normally should have come to HAL, Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, which is a government institution, and part of it actually went to a private company with a well-known financier and businessman. And the question is, well, isn't that against India's interest? Well, actually, it's more complicated than that. And I can't say that I have the full picture of everything that was involved in that decision. But what you have to see is India had developed over time certain capabilities. But because of the Nehruvian mindset, the capabilities were highly restricted. The finances had been majorly, let's say, wasted. The amount of corruption in institutions had become so endemic that there had to be a counterbalance with some kind of a public-private partnership. Now, I'm not saying private is free of corruption. Private is equally corrupt or can be worse, more corrupt than governments even. To me, the question is not about government, public or private. It's about people who are not essentially corrupt, or even if they are making money on the side which is outside the system, they don't compromise the ideals and the quality of the material and the production. That is for me the most important factor. And there is no way to avoid this as long as people are in themselves fundamentally corrupt. A government institution can be just as effective and free of corruption as a private, or a private can be just as corrupt as a government institution. So for me, that's not an issue. What was important was the capability to build. And the capacity to build had been already constrained because of infrastructure, because of past inertia and so on. So one of the things which Modi has done in the last 8 years was to open to this public-private partnerships where others could have a chance to come in, but with tighter controls to ensure there is no misuse. And it was a necessary part of development that certain things had to be opened out to private industry. For example, even when you look at the space technology of India, if everything had to be made by one institution, it's not financially viable. You do not have numbers, for example. To build certain components which are very specialized, if you just build 10 of them, it's not viable. But if there's a company that's building 100 or 1,000 and you buy 10 from them, that's viable. So certain elements had to be outsourced, inevitably. Which elements, what balance, I cannot say, because it goes too deep into the technologies involved. And so still you recognize the principle. So ISRO, for example, the Indian Space Research Organization, consciously began a process of delegating technologies to institutions in the last 2 years. I personally thought it was very dangerous what they did. And in the process, what happened is many scientists who were part of the Indian Space Research Organization would be tempted to leave and form startups, which are now being funded by the government, and with a handover of technology, and then they become competitors, or they become, especially in space technology, it's easy to build a monopoly because they now have patents, and now they can ensure that you can't compete because they hold the patents. Whereas as long as the technology was developed in the government-owned institutions, patents were necessarily available to the public. But from the private, they may not be available to the government. So there's a risk there involved. But what it can do is to allow innovation in a way that would not be possible with one centralized institution. So again, going back to the principle behind, and the spiritual and the evolutionary principle behind, you see, in evolution, you never have one center which does everything. Nature works with 20 centers at a time, and then eventually drops a few, builds a few, whatever works better is unified, etc. We see this also in the way the mother worked in the ashram. She would, when she had to create something, she would not delegate to one person. She would be delegating it to 3 people with some variations, knowing that if there was one person or one point of effort, the opposing forces could easily block it. When there is 3, it's much more difficult to block it. And inevitably it would happen that one would not succeed, one would fail badly, one would have half a success, and there would be another which would be much more effective. So often we had these very duplicate capabilities built up, but we can understand why, for the rapidity of the progress. So I'm not saying I can give you an exact reason for these things, but I'm giving you the rationale for why a kind of a decentralization and delegation with a mix of public-private partnership would be essential. If you look at the roads building, for example, we have some of the best road building capabilities with the military, with the Border Roads Organization. It's not scalable to national level. If you did the scaling there, the costs and other complexities would be too great. Corruption, even a small percent, would be much more exaggerated and so on. So a kind of a public-private partnership. But with tight controls, where the quality is controlled, the results, timelines are held, and there are built-in protections. So if your government institution is good in its intention, then one can partner with others and ensure that there is not enough corruption, and you can scale massively. You can have 10 groups operating simultaneously, where earlier only one would be struggling to scale. So these are angles which I would share. I don't know if it is good enough as an answer, but it gives you an idea of the complexities of the decision making also. This is as far as this issue is concerned. But I'm going to continue now with a few points about Modi, about Elon Musk, but I will also introduce the other three names that I have in mind, and then maybe a few more that may come later as we proceed. So the third name which I want to introduce also, and do be careful about reactions from the media programming. The third name is Putin. Vladimir Putin is a major disruptor. His background I will come to shortly today, and I will link these with Elon Musk and Modi, and you'll see something common among all of them. But just quickly to mention about Putin, he grew up inside the KGB. He was one of the very effective members of what was at that time the KGB, or the intelligence department of the erstwhile Soviet Union, later Russia. And what is interesting about him is an article that you will find which is dated about 1998 or 99. I have stored all these somewhere, but I could not find them in time. But where one of these journals from the United States, I believe it was Washington Post or it could be the New York Times, has this very prominent article by somebody who says that during his visit to the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Union Russia, he interacted with many in the government, and corruption was endemic. That was the nature of the communist system. But he met this one unusual fellow who he mentions as Vladimir Putin, who told him, oh, you want this work done? Okay, you will get it done. And this American was waiting for the kickback, and there was no such request. And then he was surprised the work actually got done within a few days, where normally even paying kickbacks in the corrupt system, it would have taken them weeks, months, or you had to keep going back to chase them to overcome the inertia of the bureaucratic system. And he was surprised about this. And subsequently, it turned out that this is one man who had a reputation for always doing your work, never asking for money, and standing for a certain kind of idealism. Now, what happened was, in the breakdown of Soviet Union, there was Gorbachev was the key agent at that point for taking a decision to end the USSR and allow the decentralization and the breakup, so to say, of this behemoth, to allow individual nationalities to then prosper independently. This step he took was radical. We were told at that time, when he was talking of perestroika and glasnost openness and such things, we were told that he had actually read Sri Aurobindo's writings. And this was 1989 or so. At that time, we did not have, the internet was just beginning, and it was mostly word of mouth. We had friends in Russia who said that we know for a fact that he had read the books of Sri Aurobindo. Subsequently, I also heard from Vladimir in Oroville, who shared how, because he was a student of linguistics, he was allowed to read Sri Aurobindo's books, but they were kept in a vault, not accessible to public, and he had to go through strict security regulations, and he would get the book of Sri Aurobindo from the collected works, sit down, and the first time he sat with it, he just felt the presence and the power with such deep intensity, he couldn't even read. He was just overwhelmed, and he had to make a second trip to start reading. But he was granted special permission because of that. So these books were known, they were available with the government, but they were prevented from the public, except when the public was secretly in what was called the black trade, making copies and circulating around. So it is quite likely that it's possible Gorbachev was into this. But what happened subsequently is interesting. Gorbachev was overthrown by Yeltsin. And the whole method in which he was overthrown, you had tanks surrounding and so on. And Yeltsin was at that time known as a CIA asset. So what would have originally taken the USSR and then now liberated Russia in a very different direction under Gorbachev was toppled by Yeltsin, and the immediate result of Yeltsin taking over was extreme corruption, the oligarchs which formed and so on. And at some point, Vladimir Putin led a kind of an internal coup, which was done using internal methods. There was no breakdown of, let's say, official principles of the constitution and so on. But he led a coup, pushed out that entire guard and took over. From that point where he came to power, in the next, let's say, 8 years, what he achieved is very similar to what Modi did in India. He began with a country in which there was severe food shortage, there was a shortage of power, and there was a problem with extensive corruption. And like Modi, he began a complete restructuring process. Now, initially, you must understand the common feature between Modi and Putin initially. When you take up a machinery that is so corrupted that nothing works, or that anything you try to do will get subverted, will get distorted, will get blocked, delayed, you have to centralize excessively. First of all, to weed out the corruption, and second, then to ensure that there is no misuse of the new attempts, that things actually get done, and until a new culture is rebuilt and the wrong people removed, the right people put in place, and so on, until the revamping is complete, you cannot delegate. If you see what Modi did in the first 4 years, it was mostly this centralization process and then pushing a bureaucracy which was opposing him. And I know this because I actually was there at some point. I had to go for some work, and I was in the department which was Ministry of Human Resources perhaps. And I went with a very weird request, which may seem strange, but I went with a request to the lady who was at that point the head. And I said, in the Pondicherry University, there is a center for Southeast Asian Christian studies, and then there is a center for various other studies, but there is no center for Sri Aurobindo studies. Can you please grant that? It was a very impersonal request. There was no question of any benefits to anyone. It was just in national interest. And the lady actually said, yes, of course it will be done. It's a very good idea. And then she said, she boasted about what good she was doing. I don't know much about whether that was true, but it sounded nice. And then she said, by this evening the orders will be issued, and within a month the funds will be transferred. That was the promise she gave. Nothing happened. Then she passed me on to a bureaucrat. And when I went to the bureaucrat for the implementation part, you could see the man was hostile. He was against any change. He was against the government. He was against what was happening. Their domain of possession and their interests were being overridden. And I was sure this man would block everything. As it turned out, no funds were issued, no letter went out. 2 years passed. I'd given up hope. I did my part, my work was done. 2 years later, I heard the story that suddenly a center for Sri Aurobindo studies was going to be opened in Pondicherry University, and they were looking for the right person. When I had gone there, I'd even suggested 3 or 4 names, which I thought would be, so that the government at least doesn't go around looking for it. Somehow that had not gone through, but it took 2 years to get to this point. And I don't know what happened. I've been out of this circuit for a while, so I don't really know what happened. My fear was it would go into the wrong hands, and then you know what happens typically. So this is an interesting point, that inevitably there is this excessive centralization required, and for which you can easily be criticized. You are dominant, you are, what are the names you use for a tyrant and so on. But for what intention? There's a very interesting phrase the mother used at some point. It was towards the end 1960s, where she said, because of what had happened, the mess which had happened, she said, and this is the exact quote as far as I can recall, she said that it would be useful for India to have a dose of a benevolent dictatorship. A dose of benevolent dictatorship is the phrase as I recall. And what is interesting, at that time Indira Gandhi had come to the mother because of past connection, you know, when she was still a young lady, she had come with her father who was Prime Minister. And there is this photograph of the mother sitting with these 4 people. And the 4 people next to her in chain all became Prime Minister. The last, who was Kamraj, almost became Prime Minister. Effectively, he was de facto, or he missed by a whiff. But Indira Gandhi when at that point she was part of this group, what was at that point the Congress, and she came to the mother. I believe it was 1969 or so. It's an incident which Udar narrates because he says he took her to the mother at that point, and she went in like a lamb, and he says he was waiting outside. She came out like a tiger. And as he quotes the mother saying that afterwards when he went to see the mother said, I brought down the highest power on her, and she absorbed it all. So she comes out like a tiger, as Udar described. She goes back from here and she creates this split in the Congress party and becomes Congress I for Indira. So I, it's a symbolic also of the ego assertion, but still. And interestingly, she then takes over. And that entire group, the old people who were stuck in the old mold, just become irrelevant, just like that overnight. She had this very strong taint of becoming a dictator's kind of, but as long as it was benevolent, it would have been good. But you see what happened later, the dictatorship became too much, the ego overrode, and the emergency and other perversions came. But you see the tendency and the need for that kind of a strong force to unify, to unite, to be able to make a shift. So you see this in Modi in the first 4 years, and then he starts delegating rapidly because he's built a core team that he can rely on. He's found a way now to find the right people and delegate to them and rapidly replace them if they are not effective. You see the similar phase of Vladimir Putin, where the first 4 years he's a dictator almost, but he gets the work done. And he brings for the first time food stability and electricity all over the country. Exact same thing that Modi did. Within 4 years of coming to power, every single village in India was electrified with electricity, and in most places all over the country, this constant power failures which were part of our life during summers particularly had stopped in most places all over India. Why? Because he boosted the power, he reduced the wastage, many things which he did. Among them, the innovation shift to LED technology to reduce consumption and so on. Everything was done in 4 years. What was not done in 70 years was completed in 4 years by Modi. Every last village had been electrified. You see the same pattern with Vladimir Putin. So you see in a common feature, and I will come to the fourth person also shortly, a common feature is that they love their country, they dedicate themselves to their country. But the love for the country is not a domination of others, necessarily at least. Or where there's a conflict with other interests in a significant way, the choice of your country, but not at the cost of destroying the other country. This is an interesting element, quite different from what you saw during the Second World War or the First World War, where the national ego seized. Under Nazism, it was the national ego which then wanted to destroy, subvert, even oppress other countries. It's not that. It's not an ego-based nationalism, but it is a healthy nationalism which is more universal in its approach. So Vladimir Putin is the third of the disruptors. What the relationship is with the Ukraine war is something which we will look at separately. I want to dedicate a whole discussion to wars, including Ukraine war and the current Israel-Hamas war. And we will have to understand the rationale and the compulsions which led to these, in what way these were avoidable or unavoidable, and what are the means to come out once you understand the forces involved. But I'll keep that separately. But understand now Putin in terms of what he represents for Russia, development of Russia, and subsequently its relation with the world. And we see again Putin taking a similar approach: economic development first, well-being of the people first, and with that ramping up economically in a way that was outside cabal control. The result is the mainstream media, at least on an international English space, turns against him, and violently. And one of the things they use labels, slurs. Again, these are, remember, keywords. And these keywords are part of a programming. So one of the things they will say, oligarch. All of Putin's friends are oligarchs. And what is an oligarch? And you've been taught this: these are corrupt businessmen who seize money and give it back to the person from whom they have received the political power or influence. As a routine, any Russian businessman is labeled oligarch, and especially if he's close to Putin, he is called a Putin oligarch or mafia. It was a fact that mafia and oligarchism had happened under Yeltsin. Putin actually reversed it. So the Yeltsin control, remember, was a CIA-based control, and Putin reversed that and actually threw out the control systems that they had put in place. So the result was the CIA had to rebuild its means, access new funding groups, NGOs and so on, where again Putin was very harsh against them, so which was turned as intolerant, against free speech and so on. So you have to understand how these labels are used to criticize anybody. This is as much as I will go as far with Putin. We will come back to him as part of a larger picture. And the fourth name which I will go to, which will be a major trigger for many, so just be conscious not to be affected, is Donald Trump. His coming to power at that point was a major disruption. If you recall, at the time when he came to power, the New York Times had as headlines the day before elections 99% chance based on polls that Hillary Clinton would win. Based on polls, 99% claim, and Trump won by a significant margin. The result was a massive reaction, and you have to see some of the videos of people in the television industry as they were reading out the numbers. You could see them in a state of shock, and some of them actually wept on television. That's the extent of the shock it created in the existing mainstream media control system. And the violence with which the media turned against him is also fascinating to watch. So, as you know, initially Hillary Clinton accused Trump of stealing the election. She refused to accept the results of the elections. Exactly the things that Trump is being accused of today when he questioned the 2020 elections. But media didn't turn against her. They promoted those views. And what I saw, because I was at that time with a group of Americans, we were traveling together. We were, I think, in a country and for some meeting. And every day they would tell me what they had just read in the newspaper. Do you know Trump is so horrible and this is what he's going to do? And this is like barely a week after election. And as you know, in the US system, it takes about 3 months before the president is formally sworn in. Before that, he has to put together his team, he has to put together his cabinet, start a process in which there's a handover of the power structure and so on. He's not even put his team together. And we are being told by the mainstream media who his cabinet is going to be, which he himself does not know. Isn't it amazing? And all the names being given were the most horrible people that they could imagine. So I was seeing this happen, and that's the first time. Till then I didn't know what Trump represented. And that's the first time I began to question, why is the media so violently lying against Trump? What does he represent that they're so afraid of, that they have to vilify him from the very first day in such an extreme manner, by blatantly lying? Because they would tell you that he has decided so and so will be his cabinet. And the names were the horrible mafia-connected people. And obviously he's not that stupid, as he has not even put together his team. You don't do that, because when you assemble a team, it's a long process. So that's when I got the first sign that something was wrong. Then I began to look more deeply into the things, and then it was obvious what the game was. What actually happened, and the full picture is not commonly known because the media never speaks of these things. In the transition, Obama was to demit office. They were putting in place a system to subvert Trump's administration. And among the things which they did at that point was, Obama passed an order, which was, I believe, just 4 or 5 days before he demits office, in which any intelligence coming in regarding internal matters and even communications relating to the President of the United States would automatically be shared across 16 different agencies. Now, normally intelligence agencies create a firewall among them. Certain elements are shared, but it's done in a very controlled manner, precisely because you don't want all data to be easily stolen. But Obama passed actually a special executive order by which any data coming in was automatically shared across 16 agencies. Now, this is extremely dangerous for the intelligence data and for the sources. Because if you have one leak in any one of them, then, and obviously some of them do leak. Why was this done? Because subsequently everything that involved Trump was now available across all of them, and any part that they controlled was enough for them to leak information. So it is very interesting how far they went to ensure that he was rigged from the beginning. And then the media started this whole accusation of the Russia collusion. You will have seen this, it lasted through entire of Trump's presidency, that he was accused of colluding with Russia. There was a whole investigation that was started that spent, I believe, $40 million. It interviewed some several thousand people, went through all the evidence, and at the end of it came out saying there is no evidence of any collusion. But after 2 years, during which time the entire presidency was hijacked. And you have to understand what the game was. The fear was that Trump would, as a disruptor, would align with Putin as a disruptor. And if this happened, the disruption would be too great for the cabal to manage. So what they did was, they started by an accusation that you are colluding with the other. What do you do when you are accused something like that? You say, no, that's not true. To prove that it's not true, you have to actually demonstrate through actions. So the result was they subverted from the beginning any kind of realignment between Russia and friendship between Russia and the United States. Why is this important? Go back and look at the big picture now. We have to remember there's something happening consistently for the last 100 years. When President Kennedy was assassinated, the mother made this observation. She said he was trying to bring friendship between the United States and Russia and Soviet Union and end the Cold War. And then she says, the power which is behind the Catholic Church could not allow that. And so he was eliminated. This is fascinating when you actually consider the implications of this. So she's speaking of a power which is working from behind. Doesn't mean everybody is under that power, but it's behind an institution. And what is that power? She's referring obviously to an occult power and an Asuric force, which does not want friendship between USSR and United States. Because the end of the Cold War would have been the beginning of the freedom for humanity. Cold War was the excuse, was the framework under which both sides were held in compression, and any forward progress was blocked by the other due to rivalries. The entire world was divided into pro and against these two side blocks. India was part of what was called the non-aligned movement, which was idealistic in a way, but very impractical. It did serve a purpose. It was not very effective though, but it served a purpose. And the very fact that India was effectively the leader for the non-aligned movement is symbolic again. That same pattern you see subsequently. So when Trump comes to power, to prevent a rapprochement between Russia and the United States, which would have tilted the balance totally for the cabal interests, this false accusation was made. It was hammered by the mainstream media, and if you look at the evidence, it is actually shocking. You had people coming out from the intelligence agencies stating that they had evidence. Newspapers were publishing statements by elite names saying we have seen evidence. You had Democrats and Republicans, both sides, both parties, saying they had evidence and that Trump was in collusion or corrupt and so on. And I remember discussion we have had before about how intelligence agencies are the institutions in which the cabal can easily hide. So they control statements that come from these ex-intelligence agents and so on. All this was done. And when finally the investigation went through, it was the Mueller investigation, they looked for some sign, something to prove, and found nothing with $40 million and thousands of documents and witnesses interviewed. Not one thing, not one shred. Instead, the dossier on which this whole accusation was initially concocted was traced to a British agent who was an outsourcing agent. It was not even owned by the British MI6. And he was then linked to a group that was anti-Putin, and the funding of the dossier was coming from the Democrat Party from Hillary Clinton. All that was traced, and it was part of the evidence that actually came. But effectively, it showed that it was entirely cooked up, it was hollow, and it was intended to prevent rapprochement. And this we have to understand the nature of the game. And then they had to ensure Trump can never again come back to power because it was too dangerous. The things he did to disrupt. He set back the cabal plans by at least 8 years. And it took them a long while to try to rebuild and to sink the economy the way they needed it to be. So you see what happened under Obama. The US economy was sinking rapidly for 8 years. And at the end of it, when Trump was saying, while Obama and Trump were fighting in their electoral battles, Trump was saying, I will set right the economy. When he was asked how, he said, I will just do it. He gave certain things, but how would you do those things? Because I'll just do them. And Obama was on record saying, you can't just wave a wand and change the economy. This is the nature of the global economy. There is nothing that can be done. It is impossible to rebuild it. What Trump did in 2 years, he rebuilt the economy in a way I did not think it would be possible. Just looking at the data, I did not think it was possible. It showed the extent of the corruption though. And just by reversing that and setting forward the policies which he announced, he was extremely transparent. Everything he said he would do, he did. Of course, with the same pushback from the intelligence agencies, from the bureaucracy, and from his own party members, similar to what Modi experienced. So, still, in spite of that, in 2 years, he turned around the US economy. By the end of his 4th year of a term, the US economy was booming as it had not for the last 45 years. This was unexplainable unless you realize how much the subversion was being done deliberately. Just by reversing those policies, he achieved this. And a benefit within 4 years of undoing the damage of 45 years. It's extraordinary what he achieved. And we have to understand his background, and I'll come to that also shortly. But just that one thing, and the economy. You can blame him for everything else that the media used to blame him for. They said his tweets were mean. They said he was doing nothing, he was sulking, that he was corrupt, or you can choose to believe or disbelieve. They were so subjective as accusations. To me, they never made sense. For example, there was a news item that said Trump was sulking, sitting in his New Jersey apartment all alone. He had sent everybody out and he spent the whole day sulking. So I said to myself, if actually that happened, how would the New York Times know about it? There had to be someone inside who would leak it out. And if he was there just with his butler, as they claimed, then the butler would be the one leaking it out and he would be thrown out the next day. So who is giving this information? Or it's totally made up. And as it turned out, a lot of the accusations against him were totally made up. And I'll give you a few examples of how it worked. So there was a news item that Trump is now going to take over NASA, the US space agency, and shut it down. And this was headlines all over in the mainstream media. I looked at it and I said, okay, if this is going to be true, then there is no way that they can know about it. He had announced that he is going to put out a new policy for NASA, and they were all saying he's going to shut it down. And then I thought about what is his main pitch, make America great again. If you shut down NASA, America won't be great again. And already by that time, about 2 years had passed. So he had track record of living up to his word. So I said, there's no way this can happen. And I made a guess that he was going to go in a certain specific direction, which turned out to be correct. When he actually announced his plans for NASA, the entire mainstream media, which had been hammering on you that he's going to shut down NASA, they went silent. What he did was he increased NASA funding. He redirected goals of NASA though. Where earlier Obama, in his beginning of his second tenure, or let's say it's end of first tenure, had announced, I think it was in 2010, he announced plan to send man to Mars. Just like that. And so all the funding on NASA was diverted to Mars. And I said to myself, I'm going purely by the technology. This is the most stupid thing. It is impossible to do. Always, original NASA plans for space development were set up a base on the moon. Once you have a base on the moon, you can easily launch because the gravity being so much lower, you have resources you can build there, you can easily launch from there at much lower cost and do all kinds of space missions. And it was that which was blocked originally. You see, from 1974, they stopped all the moon, and we have discussed that before, I won't go into it. What Trump did, he brought back the focus to the moon and announced putting man on the moon once again. 2024 or 25, I think, is the date he has set for this, and increased funding for NASA, but put deadlines, put timelines, not something arbitrary, okay, go to Mars somehow, and meanwhile you get lots of money to just waste in speculation and meaningless technologies. And here things were being built. And what he did, he also ensured a lot of this was not dependent entirely on NASA. Some of it went to private partnerships to ensure the timelines. And he shifted the whole focus to practical outcomes. Built international partnerships, which was called the Artemis Accords, of which I think India is also a part now. I'm worried about that because there's a tendency for the US government and US policies, when they align with other countries, they align into a stranglehold. That's a concern we have based on past track record. Perhaps it will be different under Trump, I don't know. But I was concerned about this also. I'm just telling you the way the thinking worked from my viewpoint. But what he did was the most rational thing, the most practical thing, and would actually set a base for a Mars mission if you ever decided to do that in the future. And what actually happened under Obama from 2010 to 2016, nothing had moved as regards Mars mission. And again, they expected the next president would say, okay, more funding for something which comes again 10 years later and 10 years later. This is the game we have seen going back for the last 40 years. Trump changed it, just in space technology. But he changed many more things. One of the first things he did on coming to power, he pulled out of various agreements which had been made earlier under Obama. These included agreements which involved, let's say, the climate change. He pulled out of the Paris Accord. He pulled out of the free trade agreement of North America, what was NAFTA at that time. I remember at that time a front page article on Times magazine when NAFTA was being pushed. They showed a little baby and food being shoved in its mouth against him, greens, and then the title was, "Eat it, it's good for you." So you were being told, you were being programmed that, look, this is going to be painful, but it's good for you in the long run. What it did actually was, it just shifted all the industries out of the US, moved them to particularly south of the border into Mexico and other countries where work was cheaper, and all of US economy was crashing because there was no work left. You were only a consumer with printed money, no production taking place. What did Trump do? Before he became president, and this is brilliant as a strategy, he kept hammering away what he's going to do. And because he is not cabal controlled, everyone knew, that is the cabal side and the industries, they knew that he is going to stick to his word. Or they hoped he might not, but track record was different. So everyone knew, and he said, the day I am president, I am going to pass whatever orders to sanction companies which are taking jobs outside. What was fascinating was, from the moment it was announced that he won, he had 3 months, remember, all these companies which were shifting jobs out began the reverse process. They began to hire Americans for the software industry, which was bad for Indians. No problem, it's good for America. He's there for America, not for India. Second, I think it was GM, perhaps General Motors, one of these big companies which was going to start a new auto plant, a manufacturing plant in Mexico. It announced that it was shifting the base back to US because they knew they had just 3 months to make the transition. Because if Trump passed those orders, they would not be able, they would lose the continuity of their jobs. So they started making the transition well before. By the time Trump was sworn in as president, the entire landscape of this job exports had shifted. Everyone had shifted to a base of stability within America. It was amazing. He actually did nothing. He did not need to pass those orders. Just speaking of it, threatening to do it, he got them to change because they knew he was talking business. So we have to understand the mindset of the man and what he comes from and the track record. So just as I gave you a brief background of Putin, I've not yet given you a background of Modi that I had promised last time, but we'll come to that. Look at Trump. Trump is a businessman first. Putin, in contrast, is a man of action because being in the KGB, he had to get things done, but he's grown through the system, and from inside the system, knowing how it works, knowing its corruption, knowing the ropes, has been able to subvert or change it. Trump comes from outside the system. He is the first president, US president, at least in 100 years, who is an outsider to politics. Almost all the others were either groomed for politics or were part of the political lineages or had been in politics for a couple of, maybe a decade. Obama was shorter, perhaps, but still he was in the politics, had gone through the system where you do not survive unless you are corrupt and part of the system. He comes from outside, a complete newbie. He is not controlled. Financially, he is totally independent. Everybody else, to ensure that they become president, have to take money from so many sources. And all of them come with conditions applied. So if you take money from the gun lobby, well, you have to follow the gun lobby's interests, car lobby, and so on. So all the lobbies give you the money to take back something in return. So effectively, even before you have won or lost, your agenda is limited to what they have defined for you. You are trapped. You are not really free. Trump is the first president, at least in 100 years, I don't know before that, who is completely free because financially he was independent. The one who came closest before him was this Ross Perot, who 1992 or so, we had a lot of hope that he would be a first outsider to step in. He was also a businessman. He stepped out at the last minute, I believe because they found a point of blackmail, and he just resigned for no reason. Trump, they could not find, or they thought they had many points, but when it came to the crunch, none of those stood up. So, all kinds of scandals that they tried to associate him with his past, eventually nothing stood the scrutiny. You may say, yes, but the media keeps speaking. Yes, they keep speaking, but eventually nothing could stand scrutiny. That's the interesting thing. And then, of course, you can criticize him for words used, but in terms of actions, you cannot find him corrupt. He is currently under massive legal attacks. As you know, there's a lot of media headlines around this showing how he was corrupt. If you think about it, what did he do supposedly in these legal attacks? He borrowed money against properties that he had from the banks. They lent him money. He's paid back the money with interest. It's over. The transactions are finished. Nobody has lost. Everybody's benefited. And now the New York AG is going against him, saying, you hyped the value of the property when you borrowed money. Now, if that is the rationale for putting somebody in jail, or what they are threatening is to seize the properties, take it away from Trump family control and seize them, and either sell them or transfer them to the state. On that basis, any transaction where anyone has borrowed money could be brought into question. But what's the rationale? The whole thing is done. The bank was happy. Trump company was happy. And if you see what is interesting, because Trump is rock solid with his business, each of those where he gives a statement about the worth of the property against which he is borrowing money, each begins with a clause that says, we are giving you our data, you do your due diligence, don't rely on our data, do your own due diligence and find your own value. It starts with that clause. Now technically with that clause, they have absolved themselves of all responsibility for any number they may have claimed. Because the bank is supposed to do its own verification and lend you money based on what it thinks is the actual value of property. Also, going back to the past, the sense of the projection of property worth would be different from hindsight. Today you look back and say, yeah, you can't have said that then. But that was the mood of the economy then. So just on these two grounds, and legally just on the ground of that disclaimer clause, none of these cases should stand. the fact that the cases are still hammered away, the fact that for these cases Trump's children are being brought in. And if you look at the media headlines, they're all extremely derogatory of Trump or their statements. They will say things like, oh, they again spewed nonsense, evaded questioning. So I look at these headlines, then I say, all right, I'm assuming this is true. Let me see if it's true. And I read the transcript of what happens in the court, and the headline is completely fake. They're relying on the fact that you will read those headlines, and the fact that 20 headlines from different sources are telling you something negative, oh, there must be a truth to it, and you accept it. And that's the way the programming works. You look at the actual statements made by Trump in the court, and you will laugh at the judge and the ridiculousness of the entire the charade that is happening. It's very clear he will win. He may lose because the judge is biased, but then it will go on appeal eventually to Supreme Court. At some point he will win. But they will have, their objective would have been served. They would have vilified him in the eyes of people, and by the fact that he is constantly being threatened and prevented from doing his actual work of electioneering. These are the things which are the goals of these attacks. So I'm giving you a background of some of the events. It's a bit scattered, but you understand that the media is out for him and the cabal interests are out for him. He's outside the system of people who have been career politicians, and he's a businessman. So as a businessman, he has been one of the most amazingly effective. What he achieved, again, I give the analogy with Elon Musk, is something so extraordinary. He comes, okay, his father was a builder, he built cheap housing. Trump learns the mechanism of the building industry and then starts building elite housing, and suddenly massively amplifies profits. So obviously he had a support to start with, and that's good. But again, I'll show you 100 different children of people who are in the business of construction. Nobody makes that kind of leap the way he did. And rapidly he built some of the most elite properties all over the country and then all over the world, brands his name and so on. There's an example which is shared by one of Trump's secretaries, and everybody who's worked with him is only admiration. None of them criticize him, except in the political space where that's a different story. There are other interests. But all those who worked with him in the business. So this secretary states how there was a group of, I believe they were Chinese investors. They were coming to buy a specific property. Trump began to pitch a different property which was on the other side of the river in New York City. And everybody said, what are you doing? They are coming for this. And they said, no, we are not interested in that. They kept saying, we are not interested in that. We are just coming for this. Trump did not budge. So it took about 3 days. At the end of the 3 days of negotiation, they had bought the entire property on the other side, and that led eventually to the massive development of housing properties there, of which I'm sure Trump was a partner. I don't know what was the nature of the relationship, but massive development of those properties which are now part of the skyline of which New York City is proud. That ability to swing investors from what they were totally focused on and against anything else, to swing them around to that position, this his secretary declares is one of his great strengths. He is one of the most extraordinary negotiators. He shared some of
Sraddhalu,
this. Yes.
just 1 second. Sorry to interrupt. I think your mic.
Okay.
is
I'm
missing
sorry
from
about this. There's a problem with the connection. How long has it been bad?
No, just for the 1
Okay.
minute.
Is it clear now?
Now it's okay. Yes.
Thank
yes,
you.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay.
I don't know where it comes from.
Yeah.
Good.
So what is interesting is the power of negotiation that he has. He actually wrote a book on this, The Art of the Deal, it's called, which is very well known. And until he entered politics, look at all the interviews that he had with all the big names, from Oprah Winfrey through all these late night shows and some of the biggest names. When he got married, there's a interview that he had with his wife, together with that man who has these bands. Sorry, I forget the name. Everybody is so reverentially appreciative of him at every step. In one of these interviews, he actually says that you are an example for the young in the United States of America. These are really big names of interviewers. They say it to him. In New York City, just as an example, there was a skating rink which was not built for some 20 years. Trump offered to build it for free. He put his own money and built it within 6 months. And then he was there for the inauguration of it. Just like that, for the good of the people, that's it. And he got it done. But the reasons they gave for 20 years for not building, all those he was able to overcome in 6 months. I'm giving this as an example of how, until he entered politics, he was respected and appreciated by so many. And there's a very interesting angle which I have put as a link in the description of today's videos. I would highly recommend for you to look at that. Where 1988 Oprah Winfrey is interviewing him, and that year he had put up a full page advertisement in New York Times where he demanded that the government stop this destruction of the United States economy. All the business, all the industry, all the technology was at that time being exported first to Japan and then later on to China. And he said, you're not only taking away the jobs, you're taking away the technologies, and you're getting nothing in return for it. You're putting the US in debt. And this is coming purely from national interest. He had no other personal interest for this. His own industry was not affected. He was in real estate. It made no difference at all. He puts a full page advertisement to try to bring public awareness on this issue. So in that discussion in Oprah Winfrey's interview, she asks him, all these statements you're making are very presidential. Do you plan to run? He says, no. I'm too happy with what I'm doing and I don't need to get into that. And then she says, but if you run, he says, if I run, it will not be to lose. He explains the reasons why he thinks he will be able to win. And he does this. And what you see again, it's a track record as a businessman that he never lost. No negotiation he has lost. There are projects which have failed. That's a different story because maybe they were ahead of their time. There were issues with implementation. But every time, even when the university he tried to start, when that failed, he paid everybody off. Everybody walked out. Nobody claimed that they had lost money because of this. So you have this ability, and I compared with Elon Musk again for this ability to draw the money power and to do something worthwhile and build value. Now, from the point he becomes US president, he does this on the scale of an entire nation. And not just any nation, the United States, which at that time is in massive debts. Production is down, industries are down. He's able to reverse that. And the difference was seen in 2 years. And it continued for the third year until COVID blocked it. What he did then is so amazing. A rebuilding of the military, which again is similar to what Modi did. When he came to power, both US and India, where the military was sinking rapidly and planes were falling out literally from the sky. Plane taking off suddenly loses power, crashes. Ships had problems. And something like, I believe at that point, I remember seeing statistics, 2/3 of the US Navy was on port for repairs all the time. And what had happened was, under Obama, not only industries had been transferred to China, technologies had been transferred to China, but the US had shut down its own industries. The result was China now could control the quality of materials coming to the US. And if you remember, towards the end of Obama presidency, there was a bridge built by China, highway bridge, for cars, trucks to pass over. It just collapsed. How does that happen? Normally these things are built to have the strength for multiple times. Like if you say the load is going to be 1,000 tons, then you plan the bridge to be like 4,000 to 5,000 tons strength. It cannot collapse unless the metal is of such low standard that it does not fit what is its rating. This is what had happened in the US with steel. I'm going to go a little bit into this because it's an example of what Trump did and the kind of depth of insight which he had in what needs to be corrected. So all the steel industry had gone to China. To build any steel, you need iron ore and you need coal. Without coal, reducing the ore, you cannot get the iron and then you cannot process it for steel. So you need coal. There is no way you can have steel without coal and raw material, which is the iron ore. So people criticized Trump for reactivating the coal mines and for restarting the steel industry, which was polluting because the coal is polluting. So I remember at that time I was in one of these COP20, I don't know which, 25, 26, 27 meetings of UN on the climate summit. And the US was promoting what Trump called clean coal. And everybody laughed at that joke. How can you call coal clean? Because coal produces carbon dioxide. Trump actually was talking very good sense. The Chinese coal has very high sulfur content. US coal is among the cleanest in the world. What that means? Not carbon dioxide, but sulfur, which is poisonous. It poisons the air wherever you do this. Carbon dioxide is not a poison, it's food for the trees. So sulfur is poison, and there were other elements of mix. So if you had to produce the same steel, produce in the US with US coal or produce in China with the Chinese coal, US steel would be superior and less polluting than Chinese steel. Now you cannot tell people stop using steel. Steel will be produced anyway. But if you produce in China, it is more polluting than if you produce in the US. Plus the jobs. All the jobs have gone out. So effectively, US was buying steel from China and China was producing steel at a substandard level. Why is this critical? You saw bridges collapsing. That's critical, isn't it? Maybe it doesn't matter for a refrigerator. A refrigerator corrodes in 3 years instead of in 6 years. It's a different story. But when you go to aircraft, when you go to Navy ships, when you go to weapons, the strength and precision of the steel's grading is critical. You cannot build an aircraft with a low grade steel which is labeled as high grade because the wings will warp. The strain on the metal is so high. So if you want to rebuild what was at that time the declining US military, and this military is absolutely essential to protect from Chinese interests and the cabal, and this is part of the bigger game plan which we will look at later perhaps, then you needed a higher grade quality control of steel. And China was deliberately providing low quality steel labeled as high quality. Now, if you make a plane with that, you can test it and it's not strong enough, and you make a plane with that, your plane is going to crash. So Trump had to revamp and restart the local steel industry in the United States, bring it up to the standard that is required, and go with reliable steel which you could not get from China. And particularly the independence that you have. Now you see what China has done with battery technology. They have got, I believe, some 90% monopoly on some of the rare earth metals. So if US wants to build batteries, China can actually shut it down. And China is actually doing that. And there's this whole trade war between US and China, where China has put controls and restrictions to counter US restrictions and on technology and so on. So you are actually a battleground on technological, let's say, superiority. And we don't want the US to lose the superiority over China, because if China has the superiority and a monopoly, you have to see the mentality of China, which is global domination. Yes, US has a global domination, but at least on the pretext of freedom. China does not even have a pretext of freedom. It is the most controlled society, and that as a model is not good for the world. And so, between the two, we don't want the US to lose its technological edge over China. Ideally, every country would have its independence of technological edge, then there's no problem. But what happens then now? Trump restarts the steel industry, for which he has to restart the coal industry. And he's attacked on the pollution that he creates. And so many of the restrictions put under Obama for supposedly improving the climate and protection of environment were actually stifling economic development and blocking all further growth. I gave the example, I think 2 sessions ago, about how if you had water flowing during the rains, during winter, if you had water flowing through your property, you could not build anything under Obama's laws. Trump changed that. He said, if the water is seasonal, then you can build. If it is perennial, then you cannot build. So he made precisions of definitions, changed everything. Under Obama, the number of rules and regulations had been multiplied tenfold, supposedly for the good of the economy, for the good of the environment. But remember one thing, If you wanted to destroy a country, the easiest way is to wrap it into bureaucratic red tape, which is what happened under Obama. I'm not saying he did it deliberately or not, I don't know. But this was the result. So effectively, when Trump came to power, if you wanted to build a road or repair a road, you had to go through a process which would take 20 years from the start. Let's say now the highway, one of the major highways, has potholes. To get the contract to fill the potholes, you have to start the process today. It would take 20 years before you would get the permission. Meanwhile, what happens to the pothole? What happens to the highway? And I've seen this because I have been to the US regularly pretty much from 2007 onwards. And when I first went, the highways were pretty much excellent. And over the years, I saw the degradation of potholes until it became pretty much like India, in certain highways at least. And I was surprised that there was no repair happening. When I asked questions, nobody had an answer. This I understood after Trump came to power. He made a chart for all the permissions you had to go through and the timeline for the permissions, and the total came to 20 years. And the chart was big from the top of the room down to the floor. It was that big in minute steps. He then sat with his team or had them go through the whole process to simplify the whole process without compromising anywhere the standards of environmental protection. Now, this is a huge achievement. They reduced that 20 years span to 2 years, 1/10, without compromising environmental clearances and standards. What a huge achievement. And so he announces this. He puts this huge chart of 20 years timeline and 2 years timeline, and he says, here, compare this. And I'm showing you that there's no compromise made anywhere. He could have easily made a compromise. No, he's interested in protection of environment, but he's talking common sense. No compromise made. The whole media is sitting there. They're watching him. He does the whole presentation. And the next day in the media, zero. And this is the shocking part. This is such an extraordinary achievement. Zero on the media. What they did put, in fact, on the headlines was, after this whole presentation of whatever 1 hour or so, they asked him questions. Not one question was about what he had achieved. It was all about some riots which took place somewhere else. What do you have as opinion of this or that? And they were looking, you can see some of the interviews when they talk to him, they're fishing for, they're provoking him with statements, and they are typically those statements which are a catch-22 situation. Like, for example, if you ask somebody, do you agree to apologize to those people for your whatever insulting thoughts? And if you say, no, but I never had insulting thoughts, then see, he refuses to apologize. That's the headline. It's one of those catch-22 type questions, and they're looking for that. Eventually, there was something about a riot, and they ask a question, and he says, but both sides had good people. So what was the right thing was that this should never have happened. That became the headline for the next day. Trump claimed both sides had good people. And of course, one of the sides they've managed to vilify with certain labels. Nothing was said about this achievement. But just this one achievement meant that from that point on, within 2 years, all the highways in the United States began to get repaired. What an achievement, isn't it? And look at the bias of the media to suppress anything positive and to highlight or distort anything even small, even if not negative, to make it negative. I'm going to come back to the steel industry, but just one more example. When he went to Japan, he's standing with the Japanese Prime Minister, and there's this video recording of CNN. They feed the fish. So Trump is following. Prime Minister of Japan puts the fish food. Trump does the same. When it's over, Prime Minister of Japan turns the whole box for whatever dust, taps it, comes away. Trump does the same, comes away. If you see the full video, picture perfect. What CNN did, they edited out the Prime Minister of Japan turning the whole box. They edited out Trump putting the little bits. So they show Prime Minister putting little bits and Trump dumping the whole box. This was deliberately done. And they put this as a headline, Trump insulting the Japanese Prime Minister, Trump insulting Japanese culture, Trump is such a buffoon, such a incompetent fellow, he does not understand nuances and finesse of diplomacy, etc. This is blatant falsehood by video editing, only to vilify Trump. And this was daily, daily, in and out, in and out. And if you read the newspapers, that's why I'm saying you are triggered, you're programmed. But if you look at the alternate media, if you go behind the scenes, if you look at the actual statements he made, at the actual tweets, he was talking sense all the time. Except you warped it, you decontextualized it, you distorted the context and made him seem to be either a buffoon or an idiot or some kind of tyrant of some type. One of the accusations against him was they compared his daily routine to Obama. Obama had a daily routine of meeting X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, all pre-planned down a couple of months ahead. Trump had meetings and then large chunks of several hours which were marked executive meetings. So he had people meeting him and then executive meetings. So they said, see, he's doing nothing. What does he do? He sits watching television all the time and he gets upset when he is criticized. Not true. What is called executive meeting is a businessman's language. Because you're looking at current issues. You cannot plan them 2 months ahead. You don't know what crisis will come 2 months from now. So you have these appointments and then you're free to deal with actual work situations. And there is a parallel with Modi again. When Modi comes to power, he demands results. First, he demands the politicians, the ministers, as well as the bureaucrats to give him a timeline and program of implementation, upon which he adds his own things. And then he is monitoring them. And then every week they have to come and give reports. How much progress have you made? Are you on schedule? What are the problems? And if there are problems, what can we do to solve them? So before a problem becomes a cause for delay, we start correcting them so that you never delay on the timeline. And Trump is doing that, running it like a business, running the country like a business. Remember, he's the first businessman who is successful as a businessman who has become president of the United States, that I know of, let's say, going back 100 years. And he's applying those standards to run the country. And that's how he's able to turn around. So I come back to the story of steel. He kickstarts the mining industry, the steel industry, and from there the rebuilding of the US military. And what was done within those 4 years just to rebuild the US military is what you see today, ready for the problems that you see, whether in Ukraine or in Israel or in potentially now Taiwan as a flashpoint and other areas. If not for that, today the US military was already crippled, would be unable to prevent any of these situations from conflagrating into a third world war. This is one of the examples. Another thing he did, he boosted US oil production. Now this is one of the most extraordinary things and one of the secrets for his turning the US economy around within those first 2 years. He restarted the oil industry in the US in a way that, yes, you can say is oil industry is harmful to environment. But think of it this way. Either you're pumping out from Saudi Arabia and other countries, or you're pumping from within US soil. Eventually the same quantity is being used. You can't tell people stop using petrol. So anyway the amount will be pumped. But if you get from Saudi Arabia, you're pumping funds into Saudi Arabia, which was at that time one of the most corrupt centers, for funding extremist Islam all over the world, funding terrorism and funding human trafficking. Trump blocks the fund flow to these centers, gets oil at much lower price in the US. Oil prices came down drastically under his term, one of the lowest, and the quality of oil was superior than what was coming from the Middle East. He made US not only oil independent, he made it a net oil producer and exporter in the world, exporting more than Saudi Arabia at one point. So world global prices of oil came down because of US exports of oil. And at the same time, he used that period of low price of oil to refill what was at that point the national reserve for oil. In case of war, you see, one of the problems for the United States to be always afraid of the Middle East was they could at any point shut the oil pipeline. What happens to the US? It's totally dependent. It cannot sustain a war if it ever goes to war. China could block the oil flows to the US, and the US economy would be crippled overnight because no oil flows. By making US independent in its oil, suddenly, not only globally there was a change in oil prices, there was a glut in fact, but US now could stand on its own and not be dependent to blackmail from the Middle East or from China or Russia for that matter. And the result was it could define its own policies. Now I'm showing you the chain of the thinking. He went to first principles, foundational issues for setting right the economy and rebuilt independence of United States. And built the whole stock of what is called the emergency reserves in case of war. And all oil stops, and even if production is affected, this is your emergency reserve. From the point Trump demitted office and Biden comes in, he reverses all the Trump policies. Oil prices shoot up to become triple, in some places 7 times higher than what was under Trump in the United States. He again puts back the dependence on the Middle East and open to blackmail from Middle East. And worst of all, in order to keep the prices under control, the entire stock, which is the emergency reserves of the United States in case of war, which Trump had brought to fullness in many decades for the first time, is entirely used up under Biden to keep prices low enough, and still they are triple high. Now if there's a war, now if the US is pulled into a war and the oil supplies cut, the US economy collapses overnight. And you understand how dangerous it is for the United States, just by reversing of the Trump policies. So I'm looking at a very big picture, showing you many independent actions from Trump, a few from Putin, a few from Modi, which I've mentioned last time, to show you that how these people have disrupted the globalist policies. You see, the globalist policy wanted to reduce the whole world to dependence of a central bureaucracy, where common people would become poorer and poorer, dependent on their government, and governments would become dependent on some central controls. Trump's major plank was Make America Great Again, for which it meant effectively becoming independent economically and technologically and industrially and so on. A point had been reached where the US was producing barely 1% of its actual use. The only things it was producing independently were arms. So to keep the US economy afloat, you had to have wars where the US would keep selling arms. Trump changed that. He started bringing back all the industries to the US. Arms, yes, but the other industries now become the mainstay for US economy increasingly. So his plank of Make America Great Again, irrespective of the slogan, was of becoming independent as a unit, and in terms of technologies to bring back the strength and superiority and the lead, for which there were other steps which I am not going into now. One example was what he did with NASA. But also collaboration with globally with like-minded interests to allow for similar independence of other institutions, for which one of the key things Trump did, for which the benefit we are going to see in the next 2 or 3 years, was a military alliance with India, Japan and Australia. And done in such a way, he knew he would be replaced by somebody else later because cabal would not allow him to win the next election. It was done in such a way that the next president could not subvert this and various other alliances. And this is brilliant long-term thinking for the world. What he achieved there, it was as a bulwark against China's expansionism. If not for this, India was struggling alone. At that point, the US government until Obama had continued to fund Pakistan to bother India and to support China in ways that India was always on the weak end, financially, militarily, economically, etc., just by the repeated attacks, with an intention to keep India weak, because that was larger cabal interest. Trump reversed that. He demanded from Pakistan the elimination of all terrorism, without which funding was cut. For the first time this happened, because it was the US which was funding the terrorism through Pakistan. And as you know, the CIA had its largest base outside the US inside Pakistan, originally to fund the Taliban, but later it became funding for many other things. He stopped all that, and Pakistan began to sink economically. They could not agree to stop the terrorism because that is cabal controlled. The whole military within Pakistan is cabal controlled. So they could not agree to that. Had they agreed to that, the funds would have flowed. They could not agree to that. So they found other ways of financing through the drugs, particularly through the Taliban drugs which were grown in Afghanistan, which were routed through Pakistan and so on. But Trump blocked the financing and instead turned to India. So now you suddenly see this, which the mother had asked for in 1960s. She had said the United States has to align with India. And together the two would make the difference which would be for the world. Why? Because India had to provide the, let's say, the yoga consciousness aspect and the principle of how that can be applied in life. And the United States would provide the necessary financial and technological support. And the two combining would be the means by which the higher truth would work globally to help humanity. This almost happened under Kennedy. And when he was assassinated, it was a huge setback. And that was the point where the mother said whatever she foresaw of alliance with US and India, that had changed. And that's because that's when the cabal had taken over completely. And then for India, it meant waiting. And she said in 1972, I believe, she foresaw how the reunification of India and Pakistan would take place. Because this was just after 1971 war, where the US had backed Pakistan. Russia had backed India, but still the war was somehow prevented. That's a story in itself I've mentioned before. We can talk another time. But then she looks at the future and says, it will not be through war that Pakistan will reunite. She's seeing the future. She says, the world situation will change. The US will support India instead of Pakistan. And then bit by bit, Pakistan will begin to break up into 5 different parts, and each part will want to rejoin with India. So this is said in 1971-72. From that point till Trump put in place this new policy, 2017, let's say, it's been a few decades, but for the first time the world situation had changed enough. US backed India against Pakistan, withdrew the funding to Pakistan, and began this alliance, not only military, technological and otherwise, to put a bulwark against Pakistan terrorism as well as China's expansionism. And with this alliance in a way that it could not be reversed. And the result is the first step of the mother's foresight has come true. Second step is almost on the edge. You can see Pakistan imploding economically, and internally there are fissures. We have to see what form that takes. That's not important for now. But this realignment was a critical necessity which has been too long delayed, almost 60 years, which is now in place, in a way that could not be reversed even after the Biden administration came in. They tried hard, they've tried to bully India a little bit, but it's not stuck. So with this, I'm going to wrap up the observation I'm making of Trump. So I've spoken of Elon Musk, Modi, Putin, Trump. There's more to say among all of them. But the fifth name is, I'm putting as a disruptor, is RFK Jr. Because he's talking sense coming from the Democrat Party. Trump from the Republican side, RFK Jr. from the Democrat side, talking sense, speaking of issues openly, blatantly, without hiding, without concealing, naming names, attacking the cabal and its interests in the most direct way possible. And you can see how the media is also trying to stifle his voice. And if possible, they will try to eliminate him early on from the race itself. And even to this point where he has been asked this question and he says he's very conscious they may try to assassinate him also if he becomes too inconvenient. And so to just put this in context, there have been at least 6 known attempts of assassination against Trump while he was president. He survived all of them. And after he demitted office, at least 1 known assassination attempt, where a drone actually came to Mar-a-Lago and shot a missile. And there was bulletproof glass, but it hit at an angle where he would have been. And all this is to show you how desperate the cabal is to ensure these people are prevented because they are disrupting too much. So there's much more we will come to next time. We'll elaborate on some of these points. But there was one question which came from one of the readers named Singularity. Alina, are you on? No, you can't speak. Oh, she has a problem with the audio. Okay. So
No,
singularity.
no,
Oh, you're here.
I cannot see the questions.
Ah, okay, okay.
I don't have access to that. That's the
Okay, okay. I'm
problem.
sorry about that. So singularity asked, what do you think about Vivek Ramaswamy? And that was in the chat box last time. Yes, he also is a disruptor and naturally very inconvenient to the media. There's a difference and a similarity with Trump. Policy wise, he's almost perfectly aligned with Trump. So whether Trump comes or Ramaswamy comes, it won't make too much difference on that level, policy wise. But whether Vivek has the ability to wield a large number of people with the same business experience that Trump has and the scale that Trump has, I don't know. He's untested. But potentially, they are pretty much the same line, and potentially Vivek is very articulate, could potentially execute, to be seen. But there's one angle with Vivek though, which is different from Trump. His ability to articulate with clarity and sometimes with a very clear punch is far greater than Trump. It could be a difference of age, or it could be just that Trump has a different style of expression. You'll see one of the things, characteristics of Trump is in a single sentence as he speaks, he will have one or two diversions and come back exactly to complete his line of thought. So the structure of thought is large with multiple sub-concepts, which gives the chance for the mainstream media to edit out easily, snip out pieces, or even to make it seem like a long, or they accuse him of long ramblings reply. No, they're very structured, but because they're long and they have these multiple digressions, either the mainstream media does not want to recognize that there's a clear thought, or they want to use it against him to make it seem like it's not a clear thought. But Vivek is different. He goes spot on with very short, brief responses, and with a kind of a dynamism which is characteristic of a younger person. So I'm also very impressed with him. Don't know if he can make it all the way to the top though, because whether he has the experience to counter the cabal interests, that is to be seen. What Trump did to come to power was amazing. It's perhaps too long a discussion. He actually managed to evade the cabal traps going around zigzag, used the cabal interests against them and for his own benefit. So one of the tricks you will see in the way he plays his game, he is always on the headlines, even if it's a negative headline. So they say he lives rent-free in your head, whether you like it or not. And the cabal thinks that they're criticizing him, but actually they're promoting his message. So Trump's wall, the big beautiful wall, everybody knows about it because they kept promoting him as an attack. And they thought it would work against him. Somehow he was able to turn it around and use it to his benefit. So he has this ability, which is of a great skill. For a while, he was accused by his enemies that the CNN had actually promoted him, which is also true. But he used CNN to promote him in a way. And then CNN found out they had been used, they backed off, it was too late. He had already used them effectively. So there's a skill involved there, which is the skill that comes in his power of negotiation and understanding. He typically thinks 3 or 4 steps ahead of other people. By the way, just to put this in context, he is not an idiot, he's not a fool. His IQ is 156. That's the official level. That puts him straight away in a very high level of genius capabilities. And he has, all his life, he used this in his business. So, and this ability which he has and the experience he has, I don't know if Vivek can match. But if they joined together, it would be extraordinary for the whole US space. And if RFK Jr. on the other side joins together, it could actually heal the divide between the two camps of Republicans and Democrats. We must understand that in the US, the way it worked as well as in India so far, it used to be that both sides of the aisle were actually the same one party. We call it the uni party, but it's actually they're paid by the same people, they promote the same interests, they're all speaking together in the voice when it concerns cabal interests, and there was charade of differences and opposition. So if you look at the issues they fight over, they're so trivial, so superficial. But they make it seem like they're fighting when they're actually together. It used to be the same in India, and I've mentioned this before, I won't repeat. Trump has changed that. There's a whole new group that has formed which are fully focused on really changing things. Just as with Modi's, it's not the whole of BJP, but the core team which is fully focused on changing things. And you see this again around Putin, a group fully focused on changing things. So if RFK Jr. and Vivek Ramaswamy can actually align, it could actually heal that divide and create a team which would be good for America without the divisive character that the media is promoting throughout. That is to be seen. So we'll end with one last question from Nitin, which was last time. And he's asked, what should people do who have this potential and bright ideas but a weak vital? How can they contribute in the work of the future? Because last time I was praising Elon Musk for both the intelligence as well as the vitality. I would simply say do what you can within the capability that you currently have. Start. Don't wait. Start with what you have and what you can do. And since we are here from a spiritual perspective, work to develop your vital. Now, if you have methods known, and we have discussed some of these before, so work with the techniques and methods to develop your vitality, or from a more direct spiritual method, open yourself and all that you do to the action of the divine Shakti to work through you. Align your idealism, your intelligence, your actions, and whatever little you have of the vitality in one straight line and invoke the help for this work. And as the divine force, the divine is looking for instruments. As the divine force works through you, your limited ability will be infused with something more powerful, and the work will be done which will be greater than your capacity. And in the process, she will mold your vital, shape it, make it stronger and more capable. Now, we have seen photographs of Narendra Modi before he became chief minister, and you would not see the same level of vitality. When he became chief minister, he was trained, and it was really the crushing training, the most painful training. He was pushed to the limit, and there his capacity was built up. So that when he became prime minister, he already had a base for this. And even then you can see in that position the kind of energy that flows through him when he gives his speeches. It's amazing. You see something similar when Trump speaks, but you have to not go through the cabal things. The cabal edits out his speeches. Even CNN is on record saying, we will not tell you what he's saying in his speeches because we are trying to protect you from his fake news. No, he's the one who's calling out the fake news, which the news system distorted also. He kept saying, fake news is the enemy of the people. They turned it around, twisting it, saying Trump says the news is the enemy of the people. No, he said fake news because you're misinforming people. So CNN said, we will actually not tell you. We will not broadcast his actual statements live. We will only give you edited snippets to protect you. When Trump came to power, the New York Times had a very healthy online comment section. So any article, you had comments, sometimes going into 1,000 people commenting, which was very high quality. But when Trump came to power and the newspaper was lying about his statements, people were calling out the lies. So they shut all the healthy comment section. So to this day, you'll find New York Times, most of the articles don't have a comment section anymore. Isn't that amazing? Just to prevent exposure of the extent to which they were covering up, distorting, or actually lying, actively lying. So I'm putting all this in a very large sweep. I'm sorry, it may not be too structured. I've jumped around with many things, but you see the common structure of it all. The machinery of media is designed to oppose the disruptors. On the other side, the disruptors go through great difficulties, strong vitality, which grows from the testing circumstances because of deep commitment and idealism, and even selflessness. There is an interview of Elon Musk, which maybe I'll put on the link next time, where he's asked by Joe Rogan, you spent $40 billion, do you regret? And then he asks, he says, no, why did he do it? He says it was to protect from this mind virus which was destroying the world. And then he says, what would it be worth for you to prevent this? And Elon Musk briefly stops, thinks, and then he says, everything. To protect humanity, you should be willing to spend everything. And he did what he had to. So, coming back to Nitin's question, when you're committed to an ideal with that kind of total dedication, you're given the strength, you're given the protection, you're given the help, the intelligence. You are lifted up as an instrument to something greater than you would have been on your own efforts and energies. And we have to work towards this. I'm not saying this is going to happen overnight. It'll start by making small steps, small things. Catch what you can do and start taking small steps. Work on it. Dedicate yourself entirely to the ideal with everything you have. And then you will be carried, you will be raised, you will be built up into a powerful, effective instrument for the divine Shakti, for the divine consciousness to work. Because this period is so important. Each one of us has to do what is necessary. And together, as conscious instruments for the divine working in the world, the balance is tilting rapidly. And this is why, for the title for this session, I have given it the name Pushback. This is the not so organized pushback, but organized from the divine consciousness. Each of these units seems to be independent, working together. Modi for India, Trump for America, Elon Musk for technology, humanity, Putin for Russia. But through it all, there is a unified objective and alignment in what they are doing because of the alignment to a higher ideal, which is always for the progress of human evolution within the scope of where you are working. And the result is that the divine works through them all, through everyone, and the pushback is now sufficiently strong, the cabal sufficiently threatened, that it leads to a point where there is an open, all-out war. It's no more cabal having ascendancy over these little efforts. There's a pushback which is strong enough, and we are at that point now. Which is the reason why I've kept saying from the beginning, the next 1.5 years is the most critical. Because from both sides, all powers, all means will be exposed. The result will be what may seem to be some of the most intense, some of the most difficult conflagrations and points of conflict in every way, psychologically, militarily, economically, culturally, and spiritually, naturally. It's going to be the most intense, and the start of the war, Israel against the Hamas, is one of those flashpoints. And you see what's happening rapidly, an alignment of forces around this focal point to try to expand it. The same attempt was made with Ukraine. It could not expand beyond a point. Israel, again, the attempt is to expand it beyond a point, and hopefully it will be contained. So we will look at the war situations and a little bit of what we have discussed today. I have not yet looked at the chat box, but we will look at all these questions. And hopefully the next time we will discuss much more about the war and what it represents from this larger battleground. And you'll understand why the next 1.5 years is so critical and what these wars actually represent, not what it seems, not what the media is telling you. It's something much bigger and more complex. So I think this will be a point for a pause. Do look back, for those of you who have not seen the previous talks, look back, catch up with all of them so that it will make sense in what we discuss next time, which will be a deep dive into some of these angles which are more war related. Remember, everything that's happening out there is a reflection of what's happening within us. So if out there is this collision of interests on so many levels, in every aspect, it's the same thing happening within us. And that's why you have to be completely transparent, completely clear and open and aligned to your deepest and highest aspiration. Do not worry with your flaws. Do not worry about your limitations. Do not worry about superficial issues. Hold firm to this center. Align yourself as clearly as you can to your soul's aspiration and your loyalty to the Divine Mother and to the Divine Will. Cling to this, and all the rest will fall in place around it, and you will be helped through the crisis. Let's take a moment to concentrate in this aspiration all together, so that not only we individually can make this effort, but all as a collective also can align for the entire and exclusive commitment to the divine will and to the divine mothers working in us and in the world. Namaste.
Namaste.